Chapter 2, Warm California Sun. California, June 1961. You'll see Amarillo, Gallup, New Mexico, Flagstaff, Arizona. Don't forget Winona.
Get your kicks on Route 66. Get your kicks on Route 66.
There wasn't much left of Route 66. At one time, it was America's main street. Now, most of it had already become Interstate 40. But the towns were the same: Kingman, Barstow, San Bernardino, just like Bobby Troupe's song. We picked up the long cement river north of Dallas. Had been rolling with the flow on it for 3 days. The sun was beating down on the Golden Thunderbird as it roared down from the high desert at 85 miles per hour. Traffic was moving at close to 80, so we weren't passing that many cars. The trunk was loaded, and the back seat was also piled high with the bare necessities a couple of 19-year-olds would need when moving to California, including a reel-to-reel tape recorder. In our wallets were fake draft cards saying we were 21, the legal drinking age in Los Angeles. Asleep in the passenger seat was Ron Atkins. We'd only met a month before. Word had gotten around USL that we were both headed west, so we met, liked each other instantly, and decided to team up. I had the car, and Ron had a promise of jobs at 20th Century Fox. Ron was a big, good-looking kid with a $1 million smile and matching personality. It had definitely been fun on the road. Ahead, the brown haze that lives over Los Angeles could be seen oozing from the horizon toward the speeding T-Bird. This is it. California, here I come. The promised land, where the girls are really the most.
Well, I'm going out of west where I belong. Where the days are short and the nights are long. Where they walk and I walk. They twist and I'll twist. They shimmy and I'll shimmy. They fly and I'll fly. Well, they're out there having fun.
2 hours later, the T-Bird was creeping in bumper-to-bumper traffic on the San Bernardino Freeway. The mid-afternoon sun was trying to burn through the haze and smog. We could smell it now, and our eyes were smarting. Ron was studying the map he held in his lap. "Davy, it looks to me that this San Bernardino Freeway goes straight into Hollywood Freeway, and that's where we're going." "Turn the radio up," I said. "I want to hear this disc jockey." Sure, you just go ahead and drive and listen to the radio. Don't you worry about nothing. You just go ahead. You just leave it to me to point you in the right direction. You just be ready to start swimming when you hear the Pacific Ocean lapping over your fender skirts." Ron was mumbling as he turned the volume up and went back to studying the map. "That's the Shirelles," the disc jockey said, "with Dedicated to the One I Love. Now here's a song that was first written by a Broadway musical team back in 1934. It was recorded by this group who cut their version in 2 takes at the end of a recording session. From there, it went straight to the top of the charts a couple of months ago. It's still bouncing around this week at number 26. I'm Casey Kasem on KRLA in Pasadena, and these are the Marcells with their former number 1 song.
You saw me standing alone without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own.
Jesus, will you look at this mess? Ron said as we crawled through the downtown Los Angeles interchange. It must have been a Yankee who engineered this mother. There it is. Hollywood Freeway, straight ahead. "Yeah, I'll just stay in this fast lane," I said, seconds before stomping hard on the brake pedal when the car in front of us came to a screeching stop. The gridlock that was coming to every city in America was well underway here at Ground Zero. It was speed up, slow down, and stop, and in just a few minutes, Ron was pointing to an exit sign. "That's it, Alvarado exit, 1/2 mile. We're here, good buddy." The T-Bird peeled off at Alvarado and took a left onto a small side street named Waterloo. The Queen of Angels Hospital was looking down on us when we parked and climbed the rickety wooden stairs to a small loft in an old 2-story building. This was home to Ron's cousin, Jim Bachman, who had been in L.A. for 2 years. A graduate of Chenard Art School, he was a set designer and had been working regularly in the movie industry. Bachman came in at 7 p.m. He and Ron exchanged family news while I sized him up. Bachman was about 30, balding, had a full red beard, and he had a tendency to go off on tangents when he talked. Bachman definitely had the scoop on the movie business. He had some good news and some bad news. The bad news was this was one of the worst years in history for Hollywood studios. Cleopatra was shooting in Rome with Elizabeth Taylor, and almost nothing was happening around Los Angeles. The jobs at 20th Century Fox would have to wait. The good news was we could stay for a few days in Bachman's cramped loft and sleep on the floor until we found an apartment. That night I walked up to the Queen of Angels Hospital and called home. No, I wouldn't be back in 2 weeks like I'd promised. Maybe I'd stay a while longer. No, I didn't have a job at Fox. What would I do? Well, Bachman said there was a summer session at the famous theater school, the Pasadena Playhouse. Maybe I'd check that out. There was another promise to come home before the summer was over, before UCLA in September. Walking down the hill from the Queen of Angels, I sniffed the cool Los Angeles air. The sultry Italian girl on the other end of the telephone line and the hot summer nights of Cajun country seemed like another lifetime, although it was only 2,000 miles and a 3 days drive. Climbing those rickety stairs, the radio in the ground floor apartment was playing the Shirelles.
Each night before you go to bed, my baby, whisper a little prayer for me, my baby, and tell
2 days later, we moved into the 6th floor of an apartment building on Normandy, 3 doors up from Wilshire Boulevard and only a few minutes from Bachman. He'd already taken us to dinner at Musso Frank's, the oldest restaurant in Hollywood, and filled our heads with a ton of Hollywood history. Bachman could talk nonstop for hours, although his thoughts weren't always connected. I loved it, getting a nice feel for the city and a gold mine of information from Bachman. Ron scored a night clerk job at the front desk of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, and I was winding the T-Bird down the oldest freeway in the world to Pasadena. Parking in the 15-minute green zone, I stepped out into the Spanish stucco style of the Pasadena Playhouse courtyard. In the office, the admissions lady painted a rosy picture of what could be expected at the summer session, including a chance to compete for one of 2 full scholarships, that is, if I was accepted. After all, the standards were the highest. She showed me the pictures of recent students, including Earl Holliman, a favorite in the movie Giant. KRLA's newsman Richard Beebe had graduated in '57. Leonard Nimoy in '50. Names like Dustin Hoffman and Gene Hackman, who had been there just 2 years before, were still unknown. What were your grades like in high school and college? I loved it when admissions people asked me that question. 4.0 in high school, valedictorian, 3.5 in college, I smiled. And don't worry about the scholarship. I've already committed to UCLA Film School in September. Her ears visibly picked up. Oh, UCLA. Well, that's just fine. But we'd like to have a student with your academic record here in our summer session. You'd have to pass the acting audition, of course, and it might be fun to compete for the scholarship anyway. Here's an admission application explaining the rules and the tuition cost. Why don't you take it with you? Classes begin next Monday. And you say you're a disc jockey? You might be interested in knowing that there's a radio station across the street. Is that where KRLA is? I asked, thinking this was getting too easy. KRLA? No, I believe it's called KPPC. Do they play rock and roll? Oh, no rock and roll. It's an FM station. They play classical music. Classical music? Oh, yes, beautiful classical music. Except when the church service is on. The radio station is owned by the church, you see. They broadcast the service live on Sunday morning and the midweek devotionals on Wednesday night. And the rest of the time they play classical, I said, losing interest quickly. Yes, just walk across Colorado Boulevard and you'll see the Pasadena Presbyterian Church, the big, beautiful building in the middle of a block. The radio station is in the basement under the church. So it's KPPC, and it's owned by the Pasadena Presbyterian Church. I guess that's why they call it KPPC, I smiled politely. Yes, I suppose so. It's FM, you know. You must have an FM radio to receive the signal. You should listen to it. They play beautiful classical music. Perhaps you could work there part-time while you're going to school at the Playhouse. Do you have an FM radio? Not yet, ma'am. I'm afraid they don't play rock and roll on FM. San Bernardino Mountains, August 1961.
this fair land when the railroad did not run. When the wild, majestic mountains stood alone against the sun. Long before
David Crosby's fingers were dancing over the 12-string guitar as he leaned back against the pine tree, stretching 60 feet into the blue mountain sky. David Crosby had just turned 20 on August 14th. Within 5 years, he and Roger McGuinn would electrify folk rock, and Crosby would go into the pages of rock and roll history. I looked out across Lake Arrowhead, where Danny Truitt and I had gone sailing earlier that day. Hard to believe we were only 3 hours from the smog of Los Angeles. It was the last weekend before summer session ended. The Pasadena Playhouse sponsored this recreation excursion. We had driven east to San Bernardino, then north up the winding road as the air got cleaner and thinner and the sky got bluer. California really was fantastic. Last weekend we were at the beach. Today we were in the mountains. Big contrast to South Louisiana's bayous and mosquitoes. As soon as David Crosby strummed the last note, Danny Truitt was talking to him. "That's a great song. Who wrote that?" Crosby replied, "A fellow named Gordon Lightfoot." "I don't think I've heard of him," I said. "Canadian folk singer," Crosby answered. "He wrote Early Morning Rain, other good folk songs too." "Folk songs, huh?" "Yeah, Pierce," Crosby said with a grin. "It's the closest thing you'll find to all that country and Cajun music you're always humming to yourself." "I like what that song has to say," Danny Truitt piped in. "It has a message." Danny was from Sacramento, 17 and totally idealistic. He followed me around like a younger brother. He was a hell of a dancer with matching physique and all-American good looks. David Crosby continued to finger the 12-string. "That song is called the Canadian Railroad Trilogy," Crosby said. "Here's another verse from it. Slower rhythm."
we are the navvies who work upon the railway, swinging our hammers in the bright blazing sun.
I wandered away from the group and hiked up the trail for a better view of Lake Arrowhead. Folk music, message songs. I'd never heard acoustic guitar played the way Crosby did. I was hooked. I was also facing a personal dilemma. The Pasadena authorities had called me in yesterday. They wanted to award me the scholarship, but knowing I was headed for UCLA, they had to know if I'd accepted before they made the announcement at the ceremony next Friday. I was surprised and amazed. The series of acting auditions all through the summer had felt good, but I still had to think the 4.0 high school and the 3.5 at USL was a big part of the decision. In any case, the problem was UCLA. In 2 years, I could get a theater arts degree from the Playhouse, but the UCLA Film School would have to be put on hold. The other scholarship would go to Danny Truitt. I liked that idea a lot. The tall pines swayed gently overhead. The crisp mountain air was the best I'd ever smelled. And Gordon Lightfoot's lyrics in David Crosby's 12-string acoustic drifted up through the trees.
There was a time in this fair land when the railroad did not run, when the wild, majestic mountains stood alone against the sun. Long before the white man and long before the wheel, when the green dog...
New Orleans, September 1961.
So kiss me and smile for me. Tell me that you'll wait for me. Hold me like you'll never let me go.
With the scholarship locked up, I took an apartment in Pasadena, and Ron Atkins went west on Wilshire into Beverly Hills. A flight home to South Louisiana brought congratulations from family and friends and publicity in the local newspaper. I felt like the conquering hero come home. My dad called me the prodigal son and promptly gathered up the fattest calf on the farm and staged a barbecue. When you've been a success all your young life, winning starts to come naturally. People expect it from you. You expect it from yourself. Hollywood was going to be easy. Now it was time to face reality again. We were in New Orleans. The flight to the coast departed in 1 hour. We drove around the Audubon Park one more time before I dropped Kate off at Dominican College. We'd said enough goodbyes. She understood California was something I just had to do, but she didn't want me to go. I'd seen this scene in the movies 100 times. If I ever had to act it, I'd have the emotional part down tight. Pasadena, California, November 1961. It was Friday night on the Pasadena Freeway. Danny Truitt and I were in the back seat of Smokey Roberts' El Dorado. Smokey was behind the wheel with Gary U.S. Bonds blaring from the radio. The rest of the Cadillac convertible was overflowing with Playhouse students, Baby Caron, James Reeder, Carol from Canada, and blonde, brassy Jill Maina from Chicago. Smokey was from El Dorado, Arkansas, a Southerner, also a former athlete and disc jockey. After one 3-hour bull session, Smokey and I knew we'd be friends for life. 2 weeks earlier, we'd become roommates, and now my social life was picking up. At least I wasn't living alone anymore on El Molino up by the railroad tracks where that lonesome whistle brought back every Jimmy Rogers and Hank Williams Train lyric that I'd ever heard. I still missed home. Mostly, I missed the Italian girl. Going to school at the Pasadena Playhouse was exciting. I liked it all, but wanted less class and more time on stage. 110 classmates were the highlight, all of them potential entertainers. The days and nights were filled with ad-lib scenarios, creative practical jokes, inventive imitations of characters, real and imagined, and the sense that we were all just months or weeks from breaking into showbiz. The DeVelles on the Cadillac El Dorado radio played on. Back at our apartment on Los Robles, Smokey entertained the group until the wee hours. He looked like a young George C. Scott out of the Paul Newman movie The Hustler. A dancer, he had a well-built, athletic upper body on his 5'7" frame. When anyone remarked about his height, his standard retort was, "I'm tall as anybody, in bed." He played folk and blues on his lyric harp, a wild-looking acoustic guitar with angelic wing-like appendages along both sides of the neck, giving it a distinct sound. At 2 a.m., I slipped into the bedroom and made one more phone call to Kate's dorm at Dominican. In New Orleans, it was 4 a.m. The phone rang nearly 20 times before I hung up. She called Monday night after I'd been through a couple of miserable days. She'd gone to see an old boyfriend. She was getting itchy about being 2,000 miles apart. Yes, she would sneak out of school and fly to Los Angeles for the weekend. The 48 hours with Kate in Los Angeles was a constant party, showing her the sights, introductions to the gang. Friday night to Sunday afternoon blew by in a flash, and it was a painful drive out to Los Angeles International. We were ready to check her luggage when the schedule flashed. Delta Airlines flight to New Orleans delayed 1 hour. We looked at each other for a long time. I grabbed Kate's hand. We ran out of the airport to the waiting T-Bird. 6 hours later, we were in Las Vegas courthouse applying for a marriage license. At 18, she was legal, but at 20, I still needed parents' permission. "What time does your shift change?" I asked the official. 8 a.m., was the stern reply. At 8:15 the next morning, we walked back into the license office, keeping my new California driver's license hidden. This time, I pulled my fake Louisiana Selective Service draft card showing I was 22. 3 hours later, we were standing in front of the proprietor of the Little Chapel of the Flowers. For $10 extra, we had the ceremony taped. For an extra $5, the proprietor's wife would have cried. That night, we were back in Pasadena. The next day, I was back on stage at the Playhouse. Only now, I had a wife.
In 1961, Cameo Parkway record executives Cal Mann and Dave Appel wrote the Bristol Stomp for an a cappella group called the DeVelles, singing about teenagers dancing a new step they call the Stomp at Fire Hall Dances in Bristol, a small industrial town near Philadelphia.
Pasadena, December 1961. We had the T-Bird loaded to the limit when we pulled up to the Richfield gas station on Orange Grove in Pasadena. School was out for the holidays and we were driving home to Louisiana. Charles Laquadera came running up to the pump. He was 6 feet tall, thin, looking like a young Ben Gazzara. He was also Italian. Charles was a Playhouse classmate from Boston with a heavy Massachusetts accent. Smokey always kidded him about it, and Charles retaliated by knocking our Southernism. Everyone always mispronounced his last name, and he always corrected them. La, Charles would say in phonetic detail. Laquadera. Jesus Christ, aren't there any Italians where you people come from? I didn't know Charles very well yet. I'd seen him in class and envied the fact that after school Charles would always drive Jill Maina to the dorm on the back of his motorbike. Kate leaned out and yelled, "Hey, Charlie, y'all got any regular gas?" "Y'all? "Do I have a frog in my pocket?" was Laquadera's reply. "A frog in your pocket? What do I care about a damned old frog in your pocket? Just fill her up," she blasted back. Kate was having trouble with Charles Laquadera's New England sense of humor. "That's the trouble with you damn Southerners," Charles needled. "Not only you can't speak English, you're not very bright." "What's his problem?" Kate asked when we drove away from the gas station. "He's just a Yankee, that's all," I said. After about a 15-minute drive through South Pasadena, we merged into Interstate 10, heading east. The Defense Department, under Ike's urging, had funded the Federal Highway Act, making the nation highly mobile for the next World War. During the 60s, I-10 would come together a few miles at a time, replacing Highway 90, the old Spanish Trail. Slowly, the 40-hour drive would shrink to 27. On the radio, Ray Charles was singing his hit.
What you say, no, no.
Hollywood, March 1962. The sensations were on KFWB when I took the Sunset on-ramp to the Hollywood freeway in my brand new white 62 Corvette. I felt very much the Angelino. The top was off and I laid a little rubber from second to third gears. The Vet merged into southbound traffic heading toward the interchange before taking the Pasadena freeway. At KFWB, the interview had not gone well. The program director had given me only a couple of minutes. My audition tape was dated, almost a year old, but the PD was definitely not interested. There was no openings coming up, not even on the weekend. He suggested that I look for work out of town, go up to Ventura or Santa Barbara, maybe down to Orange County, get some pace in my delivery. After all, KFWB was the home of B. Mitchell Reed, the fastest tongue in the West. The PD was right, of course, just as Evan Hughes had been right. You don't go from Lafayette, Louisiana, directly to Los Angeles and get a DJ job at a top rocker. It just didn't happen that way. Maybe I should back off radio and stick with acting. There was plenty of promise in that area. Jim Bachman was a valuable contact and a steady source of encouragement. While he was working on the set of The Ugly American at Universal Studios, Bachman invited me over for lunch in the commissary, where I wide-eyed several recognizable performers. Then we strolled over to the sound stage to watch Marlon Brando go through his paces. I stood a few feet away as Brando mumbled his dialogue and kept calling for his lines, while the director and crew worked take after take for America's finest actor. Things were great at the Pasadena Playhouse. The director typecast me as a football player who feared gays in support of Jim Reeder as the sensitive boy in Tea and Sympathy. Reeder reminded me so much of James Dean it hurt. The Detroit Kid, Vince D'Onofrio, blew us all away with real animal magnetism, playing Brando characters the way I wish I could. When the Playhouse officials gave me a shot at the William Holden role in Picnic, I fell right into the emotion of every small-town drifter who couldn't have the girl he really wanted. Last week, Smokey Roberts and I played a scene from The Defiant Ones for a student body assembly. Smokey did the Tony Curtis part, and I played the Sidney Poitier role. Knocked him out. The school's talent scout had called us in for a pep talk. He said Smokey showed great emotional intensity, and my dark Cajun tan and characterization had been believable in a black man's role. He said we were the kind of exciting young talent the studios were looking for. Of course we were. But I missed the turntables and microphones. The rock and roll hits just kept on coming. I wanted in. Pasadena, April 1962.
She's so pretty, Lord, she's fine. I I'm gonna make her mine, all mine. Hey, baby, I wanna know if you'll be my girl.
We parked the Vet across Colorado Boulevard up by El Molino. Kate and I walked the half block down to the Pasadena Playhouse. Charles Laquadera, Smokey Roberts, and Danny Truitt met us in the courtyard. Bud and Melanie Tedesco arrived in a couple of minutes, and we all went up to the balcony theater. Bud Tedesco was from Riverside and a Playhouse student with a character face and an extremely dry sense of humor. Mel, like Kate, worked to help put her husband through school. She was pretty, long hair, thin as a rail, and had a 3-pack-a-day habit. The single boys, Charles, Smokey, and Danny, often had dates, but when they didn't, like tonight, the 7 of us were a family. A Playhouse graduate, now a Hollywood starlet, was playing at the balcony in a show called Dream Girl. The former Peach Queen from Yuba City in Northern California, Charlotte Stewart, was blonde, beautiful, and talented. She'd already appeared on several TV shows, including My Three Sons, and was dating Tim Considine, one of the stars of that show. Over coffee after the show, the 5 Playhouse boys and 2 wives couldn't stop talking about her. I thought she was one Jolie Blanc. Danny hoped he could find a girl like Charlotte Stewart to marry someday. Smokey wanted to get her phone number and ask her out that weekend. We all agreed it took that kind of talent to make it.
She's so pretty, Lord, she's fine. I'm gonna make her mine, all mine. Hey, baby, I wanna know if you'll be my girl.
Pasadena, May 1962. The top was off the Corvette. Charles Laquadera and I were cruising Colorado Boulevard near the Playhouse. The DJ on the radio told us the Shirelles song was '1 for the 2nd week in a row. It fit our mood. The first year of the Playhouse was over. Besides being a nostalgic time of year, something else was on our minds: the draft. We were all on 2S student deferments. 1 year from now, when we graduated, we could be called in.
You know the Pasadena Presbyterian Church right there? There's a radio station down in the basement.
You kidding? Under the church? You Southern boys are shitting me again. Come on.
Seriously, KPPC. It's owned by the church, Pasadena Presbyterian Church.
So why don't you get a job? You and Smokey were supposed to be the big-ass disc jockeys, or was that a lot of Southern bull, too?
It's an FM, Charles. All they play is classical.
So what? You don't like classical?
I don't know. I never really heard that much. I like rock and roll.
I swear, you poor Southern bastards are so deprived when it comes to any kind of culture or education in the arts. Look, I've got a pretty good classical connection. Why don't we do this? We get together this fall. I'll enlighten you. David, when you hear Scheherazade or Capriccio Espagnol, you'll forget you ever even heard a damn Cajun accordion.
Sure, Charles, I'll listen. But it's not what I want. It's not what I want to play on the radio. I'm a rock jock. That's what I want to play.
So what are you going to do for the summer? Or don't you need a job?
So that would be undesirable if I didn't need a job? I need a job. I want to pay off this Corvette. So I went and I got a job. I've been counting money all summer for Bank of America. They think I'm going to make it a career. Put me in their management training program.
How did you get a job like that?
With my Southern education, that's how.
Oh, excuse me.
When they found out I was in the top 2% in the nation in math, they gave me this test. So, okay, I don't mind bragging a little bit. So far, I'm the only kid in California who answered all 20 frickin' questions correctly.
Get out of here, Mr. Humble. You can't make me believe that.
Hey, it's truth, every word. I wouldn't make that up.
Yeah, sure. And guess what? I just been named a star in Paramount's next feature film. Okay, I do believe you, David. I didn't mean to bruise your ego. It's just that all that accomplishment stuff, all the things you're talking about, that really doesn't count as far as I'm concerned. Look, you and Kate have a good summer, okay?
Sure, you bet. You too. See ya.
The Vet left only a few yards of rubber going from first to second gear. I turned up the radio and headed for the summer of '62. On August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe would die at age 36 of a drug overdose. Or maybe it was a hit. Now the blonde image of Hollywood's preeminent sex goddess would become universal for all times. In the years ahead, Marilyn Monroe's memory just like James Dean's, would seem more vivid and intriguing than real life. And dying on drugs would become the fastest exit for our heroes of the stage and screen, and the makers of music for the radio.
Have a good time, but remember, there is danger in the summer moon above. Will I see?
In 1962, Ken Kesey releases One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Helen Gurley Brown releases Sex and the Single Girl. And Walter Cronkite becomes the first news anchor to use background music in his broadcast.
KPPC FM, The Basement, Pasadena Presbyterian Church, October 1962. I took the spinning 45 off turntable 1 and glanced over at the LP that was on the air on turntable 2. This classical piece went on forever. I moved the turntable 1 lever back from 45 to 33 RPM. I didn't want to forget to do that. A Mozart LP would sound weird revved up to 45 RPM. I looked closely at the little Eva hit on the Dimension Records label, Locomotion, written by Goffin and King. Jerry Goffin and Carole King were pumping out hits, and story was they gave this one to their babysitter. Although she'd never released a record, I'd heard Carole King on a demo recording Smokey brought in from the Hollywood music publishers. Had to love her voice. I usually brought a few 45s in for my shift at KPBC FM. Playing classical music was dull, boring work. It was radio, but nothing like what I really wanted to do. So while I beamed Beethoven and Tchaikovsky to the Pasadena area, I flipped the other turntable to the audition channel and played rock hits like Neil Sedaka's Breaking Up Is Hard to Do, Sherry, Sherry Baby by Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, or the Crystals wailing out, He's a Rebel. Sometimes I felt like being a rebel and fade the monster mash in over a classical piece, or maybe let Ahab the Arab play in there faintly behind solo parts of a particularly dull classical piece. That ought to knock the little old ladies in Pasadena for a loop. I thought about it, but I never did it. Sometimes I questioned if I had the right attitude to be a rock and roll disc jockey, to do stunts like locking myself in the studio and playing Old Rivers by Walter Brennan until they kicked down the studio door and carried me out screaming, banned from the airwaves for life. Then I'd have to change my name to get a job. Maybe I'd call myself John David, like the great running back from Texas A&M. That would be a cool radio handle. The classical piece finally ended and the New World Fourth Movement was put away. I turned on the microphone and called up my best deep classical announcer's voice. You're listening to Evening Concert on KPPC FM in Pasadena, California, 106.7 on your FM dial. And now, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Wolfgang Amadeus. Now there's a great DJ name. Well, old Amadeus wasn't too bad. Some of his melodies I could recognize, but nobody could write like Jerry Goffin and Carole King. May 1963.
Little Jackie Paper loved that rascal Puff and brought him strings and sealing wax and other fancy stuff.
Kate was singing to the 7-pound bundle that she held in her arms in the back seat of Charles Lockwood Arrow's 1938 Dodge. Driving home from Huntington Hospital, Charles and I were in the front seat, high with excitement. After 9 months of waiting, John David was here. We parked in the alley by the stage door of the Playhouse and went inside to show him off. Pennies and Son was the song from the musical Fanny, currently being performed by some of the students. A big banner across the lobby of the Playhouse proclaimed, Dave Pierce and Son. 2 days later, we christened John David on a Sunday morning. That afternoon, the Pasadena Playhouse commencement exercise was held. I received a degree in theater arts, graduating cum laude. Jim Reeder was magna cum laude. Charles was just happy to graduate. At the party later, Smokey lamented the loss of his 2S student deferment. He figured he'd probably join the National Guard. Charles wondered if he could fake a bad back if he were drafted. Danny Truitt said he would fight if he was called. I was smiling inside. I knew that I'd just segued from a 2S student deferment to a 3A deferment. As a father, I would not be called to fight foreign wars on foreign soil.
In 1963, the Essex were 5 Marines stationed at Camp Lejeune, who recruited lead singer Anita Humes, the soul behind the sound in Easier Said Than Done. They thought it was the B-side and recorded it in less than 5 minutes. The Essex always appeared in full military dress.
Well, I know that I love him so, but I'm afraid that he'll never know, because I get so timid and
San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles, California, July 1963.
tell me, sing to him, swing with him, and just do anything for him. Tell him he's the one.
A group named the Essex was blasting on KRLA, and paintbrushes were swinging at 6416 Babcock in North Hollywood. Vince D'Onofrio, Jim Reeder, and Charles Laquadera were all lending a hand to spiff up the duplex purchased by my parents to solve our housing needs. My sister Russ would live in the other half of the duplex. She and her 3 children had come west to escape her bad marriage. I was the uncle on duty. It was goodbye to Pasadena, although I would have to drive the 30 minutes back to KPPC to do my classical shift. Everyone figured North Hollywood was close to where it was happening, in Hollywood and the studios. Jim Bachman was now off Highland below the Hollywood Bowl. Smokey Roberts was looking at a place in Laurel Canyon. Bud Tedesco had a job at ABC. And Vince D'Onofrio had been living in Hollywood ever since he got kicked out of the Playhouse the year before, due to his lack of respect for the Playhouse's official rules. We all took a break for lunch, laying down our paintbrushes. Russ and Kate served those foot-long hot dogs, just like the ones we always had at Dodger Stadium.
Hey, David, come here. You got to hear this, man. I listened to your classical show the other night. Man, it was dull, boring, like freaking Nowheresville. You were playing Liszt and Bach and Sibelius and Haydn, but you're leaving out all the other stuff, the really good stuff. You're just playing like the greatest hits of classical music.
Hey, listen, I never claimed to know classical music, but I am starting to recognize a few titles, and I can pronounce most of the names. This piece sounds pretty good. What is that?
Well, this is actually a big hit, but it'll work on almost any format. It's Bolero, Ravel's Bolero. Fantastic piece. You can play it as much as you want. And here's another one I want you to remember. Saber Dance by Khachaturian. You probably watch Disney movies and you've heard it. Everyone can relate to this. By the way, slide in some American stuff. Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue, An American in Paris, or speaking of blue, you can do Strauss's Blue Danube.
I don't think KPPC has any Gershwin.
So what? Take my copy. It won't be the first time you sneak a record into a radio station.
That sounds a little different. Maybe stretch a classical format. That might be a lot of fun. Hey, look, why don't you come down and do my shift with me? You could learn the board and you could engineer for me.
Yeah, I could do that. So listen, David, if I live nearby, we could ride together too. I'm not going to stay here in Pasadena with all you guys moving toward Hollywood. I could get a job delivering pizza for Arnie's just around the corner. Think about that.
You're going to deliver pizza on a motorbike.
It can happen. I already got that worked out in my brain. I'll have a bracket welded to the handlebars. All I need is a place to stay. What do you say?
There ought to be something around here close.
Let's see. Let me put it another way so you'll get my drift. How about if I stay with you guys? Wait. You got 2 bedrooms there. Your son, John David's only 2 months old. He and I could be roommates. And neither one of us would take up much room. We'd both stay out of the way. He'd be my buddy. We'd grow up together. Who knows? Maybe someday we'll be a radio team. I don't know how to tell you. I don't know how to convince you, Dave. Come on, give me a break. Think about it.
It sounds like a lot of fun, okay? But we've got to sell that idea to Kate. You know that.
No problem. I'm Italian. She's Italian. I'll appeal to her sense of ethnic Guinea duty.
Vince D'Onofrio yelled from the kitchen, "Hey, Charlie, turn off that classical crap and get back to this paintbrush." On KRLA, Wink Martindale introduced the new #1 song by Rolf Harris. North Hollywood, November 1st, 1963.
A young man rode with his head held high under the Texas sun.
Hello, David. My name is Walter Reese. I have a film company called Rainbow Pictures with a studio in Coral Gables, Florida. And I have a contract with the Air Force to shoot a recruiting film at Lackland Air Force Base here in San Antonio. Your friend in Dallas, Ron Atkins, says you're the actor I need to play the recruit. We start shooting tomorrow morning. I'll expect to see you in Texas. That was it. This could be the break I needed to get some film experience. In 6 hours, Kate and I had all the bases covered. Charles would take my classical shift at KPPC. At midnight, I flew out of LAX to San Antonio. By 7 a.m., I was having breakfast with Walter Reese a mile from Lackland at the Casa Mañana Motel where the film crew had set up headquarters. I looked the part, with one exception. The hair would have to go. Shaved down to GI length with boot camp fatigues, I looked military. It bothered me a bit that this film was designed to entice 18-year-olds to join the Air Force, something I would never do in real life. It's just an acting job, I kept saying. I don't have to believe in it. We shot for 21 days. I was getting a first-hand look at putting a film together and a real close-up of military life. Lots of structure, lots of discipline. No room for anything out of the norm. I was glad. I was only acting. The first 10 days and nights got pretty lonely until Kate and John David joined me at the Casa Mañana. Then the evenings brightened with Steve Allen on the tube and 6-month-old gagas from my son in the portable crib. There were only 4 days left to shoot on Thursday, November 21st, when President Kennedy flew into San Antonio to visit the Brooks Military Medical Facility. We watched it all on the evening news with the close-ups of the longish-haired young man with the beautiful wife. I slept badly that night as John David whined. Kate thought she smelled gas from the kitchenette. The next morning I was exhausted and stumbled through my lines on the set at the radar shack. After lunch, while the crew was collecting footage of a military parade, I fell asleep in the director's car. As the band marched and played, I had fitful dreams. At 1:15 p.m., Walter Reese shook me awake with the words that burned into my consciousness. "They killed him. They shot the president in Dallas."
For a man shut down in a Texas town in the summer of his years.
The longest weekend in history followed. The military panicked and Lackland was sealed tight. The film was on hold. The pall that gripped the world somehow seemed heaviest in that tiny motel room in San Antonio. The black and white TV screen flickered out the images. LBJ swearing in. The flight back to D.C. Lee Harvey Oswald protesting his innocence. Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas jail blasting away the answers forever. The riderless horse with the boot turned backward. The little kid's salute. In a flash, the promise of JFK and Camelot were gone. The 60s had begun. In his corner of the world, John David was spared the grief. He bounced in his crib and laughed. Somewhere in the next room, Peter, Paul, and Mary were on the radio singing the words of a Minnesota songwriter. Yes, and how many times can a man turn his head, pretending he just doesn't see? East Texas, November 27th, 1963. Trini Lopez hammered out his 2-month-old hit on the Waco, Texas radio station. The clock in the Cadillac said midnight. The highway sign read Dallas, 100 miles. The speedometer needle was steady at 85. John David was snoozing between us on the front seat. We'd taken diet pills, and our thoughts and conversation raced by faster than the darkened Texas landscape. Since November 22nd, Charles had gone into severe depression. Kate and I were worried about him. As soon as we wrapped shooting at Lackland, Kate and I packed it up and sped out of San Antonio, eager to put the Casa Mañana motel room behind us. We drove into Dallas at 2:15 a.m. and over to Ron Atkins' house. We talked till dawn and then drove straight to Dealey Plaza. We looked for the spot where the motorcade was hit. Ron showed us the Texas School Book Depository. He pointed out the grassy knoll and repeated the story floating around Dallas about other gunmen. That night we went to Jack Ruby's club and sat at the bar where Oswald had been seen. The next week I'd be flying to Miami to finish the film at the University of Miami. I figured it was a matter of convenience for Rainbow Pictures, located next door in Coral Gables. What I didn't know was the Army always shot their films there, and the University of Miami was headquarters for the Black Operatives, the largest domestic CIA station. Annual budget, $100 million.
Everybody's talking about a new way of walking. Do you want to lose your mind?
In 1963, Walk Right In was one of the first pop folk songs recorded with a 12-string guitar.
Hollywood, January 1964. Graylin Landon pulled the Beatles' Smash off the record player and sat mesmerized for a moment. Smokey and I were sitting across from Graylin's desk in the RCA Records building in Hollywood. Phenomenal, Graylin kept repeating. Phenomenal. At 40, Graylin had the graying temples to match his name, and an uncanny ability to talk a lot without giving you a clear-cut picture of where he stood. We weren't exactly sure of what his position was at RCA, but he seemed to have contacts in talent development and was some kind of liaison between the record company and Colonel Tom Parker and Elvis. At 22 years old, Smokey and I could use a guru in the music business. Graylin Landon was it. "You hear the high voice? Which one is the high voice?" Graylin asked. Like everyone else, Graylin couldn't get over the Beatles. Not only were the British rockers the biggest thing since Elvis, but their success was revitalizing the whole record industry. Everybody smelled big dollars. Graylin began issuing orders. "Smokey, you go by the Acuff Rose Publishing office on Selma. Ask the secretary for a demo record for Jimmy Economides. He's producing a session for a new girl singer next door. Get over to Capitol Records, put the demo in Jim's hand, and make sure he hears it." Smokey asked, "What do I say to him?" "Tell him this is the hottest new song that you've heard in a year. It's a definite smash, and it's just right for his girl." Do I tell him anything else?" Graylin's standard reply was, "Play it by ear." Then looking at me, he said, "Come on, Pierce, we're going to see the Colonel." The ride over to Paramount was punctuated by Graylin button-pushing the radio stations between KRLA, KHJ, and KFWB. It was important to know what they were playing. These top 40 AM rockers were the hit makers, and the Beatles were all over three rockers. "She Loves You," "Please Please Me," "Can't Buy Me Love" were all getting heavy play and on their way to the top. "You hear the high note? Which one's the high voice?" Graylin asked. As we walked up to the receptionist seated in front of the Elvis poster, I asked why we were coming to see the Colonel. "It's PR," was Graylin's reply. The Colonel's office at Paramount was one large room overflowing with Elvis paraphernalia. Posters of Elvis's movies covered every inch of wall space, stacks of Elvis records and sheet music, Elvis t-shirts, boxes of Elvis combs and pencil sets. Colonel Tom Parker was Elvis Presley's manager and reputed to own 50% of Elvis, making him one of the richest men in Hollywood. He appeared to be around 50, a somewhat rotund little man with a friendly face. He and Graylin talked in what seemed like circles. I gathered Elvis wasn't happy with his movie roles. Maybe we'd all have to go down to Long Beach in a couple of weeks when Elvis might be giving away a yacht. On the way out, the Colonel reached into a crate full of apples with Elvis' picture pasted to it. He tossed an apple over my way, saying, "Here, kid, have a souvenir." So this was PR. We drove out the Paramount gate. When Graylin punched up KHJ, I realized no one had mentioned the Beatles.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you.
In 1964, I Want to Hold Your Hand was the first Beatle record to be made using 4-track equipment.
Hollywood, February 1964.
But that train keeps rolling on down to San Antone.
Graylin Landon and I were at the ABC studio rehearsal hall watching an English director put several country and western artists through their paces for a new show called Shindig. What an Englishman was doing working on a country and western show seemed like a good question, but I never asked it. I didn't figure I'd understand Graylin's answer anyway. Johnny Cash was over in one corner of the studio pacing nervously. Graylin edged over and I followed. Johnny greeted us. I shook his hand and he looked right through me like I wasn't there. His eyes were empty. Nobody was home. The loud music from the band on stage made it impossible to pick up on their conversation, so I watched the rehearsal. After a couple of minutes, Graylin spoke. "Come on, we're going back to the office." I was about to do a nice meeting you to Johnny Cash when I realized he was coming too. The 6-block ride back to Grayland's office must have seemed like 6 miles to Johnny. Sitting behind him, I could see him twisting and turning in his seat, fidgeting, wiping his brow, and rubbing his hands together. As soon as we got to the office, Grayland headed straight for his desk, pulled out a vial of pills, and handed Johnny Cash a cup of water. Johnny slapped a handful of pills in his mouth, gulped the water, and pocketed the rest of the vial. "Yeah, thanks, man," was all he said. We all drove back to ABC and dropped Johnny Cash at the front door. His steps were springy. He was wired real tight. As we drove away, Grayland said, "He's a good boy. He's just got a problem." Back at Grayland's office, I picked up my new T-Bird, put the top down, and turned on to Sunset, heading toward Beverly Hills. I was flipping the radio through the country and western stations, trying to catch a Johnny Cash song. Hollywood, March 1964.
She could not leave a number, but I know who place to call. Cause my uncle took the message and he wrote it on the wall.
Smokey Roberts, Charles Lockwitera, and I walked into the Whiskey A Go-Go on Sunset Strip. The crowd was elbow to elbow with little room to move about. The Whiskey would become the next hot spot on the Strip, but for now, it was still the in spot for musicians and record company people for them to hang out. The main feature was quickly obvious. Hanging from the ceiling was a cage, slided to the side of the bandstand, about 10 feet above the dancing crowd. In it, one of several beautiful go-go girls who worked out nightly boogied to the rock beat. She was showing plenty of TNA through her skimpy costume. Naturally, she wore go-go boots. On the bandstand, the boy from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was breaking a sweat as he finished up Memphis. "That's our arrangement of the old Chuck Berry song," Johnny Rivers was breathing heavily into the microphone. "We hope to cut that one in our next recording session. Glad you like it." "Like it? They love it," Smokey said as we worked our way through the crowd. "It's going to be a goddamn smash." Smokey had spotted Al Schmidt up on the balcony, so we climbed the stairs as Johnny Rivers cranked up the group into another rocker. The proximity to the go-go girl was maddening. When we sat down with Al Schmidt, Lockwitera's total attention was riveted on the cage. Above the roar of the crowd and the music, Smokey quizzed Al about upcoming recording sessions. Our job was to place tunes with record producers, and this was one of the ways you got it done. Al Schmidt would soon be producing the Jefferson Airplane, and he was already a solid producer and up and coming. The music business was fast-paced and a ton of fun. Smokey was writing songs and looking down the road at recording. I didn't have that same motivation. I wanted to be on the delivery end, slapping the finished product on the turntable. Hollywood, April 1964.
Baby, take off your coat real slow.
"Aren't you an actor?" Grayland asked, knowing I would come out of my chair with excitement. "How would you like to be in a show at Melodyland?" "Of course," I answered. "Where's Melodyland?" "Anaheim, Orange County, next to Disneyland." "Small part," Grayland tempered my enthusiasm. "But you'll earn a credit for your resume." "Yeah, right. What I have to do?" "Show up at this office on Fountain near La Brea this afternoon at 3. "I understand Jerry Van Dyke is the star," Grayland said offhandedly, like it was no big deal. Oh, wow, I thought. Dick Van Dyke is the hottest comedian in showbiz, and I'll be playing with his brother Jerry. What a break. This could lead to something. "Do I get paid?" I asked. Grayland looked at me and smiled. "Play it by ear," he said. The small audition office was crowded by a dozen young actors in their early 20s, who were all antsy, trying to look cool and confident, but churning inside. The casting director, only slightly older than the actors, came out, looked us over, and pointed at 6 of us. The others were excused. "All right, you guys, here's the deal," the casting director said. "It's 10 days rehearsal and a 3-week run. You'll all play soldiers in Jerry Van Dyke's platoon. Some of you may get a couple of lines. That's the director will decide that. The pay is $50 a week, enough to buy gas. Miss a rehearsal, you'll be cut from the show. You start tomorrow at 1 p.m. at Melodyland. Everyone in?" The 6 of us all nodded. Then we all looked at each other as the casting director moved to the telephone for more important business. One of the actors was well-built, good-looking, dark-haired, self-assured, the qualities of a potential leading man. "Anybody live in the valley?" he asked. "I'm in North Hollywood," I said. "Hi, I'm Dave Pierce." "Clint Ritchie," he said. "I'm off Ventura Boulevard. We should carpool. I can't afford gas. I got to eat on that $50. Melodyland was huge, with hundreds of seats surrounding the stage in the center. Jerry Van Dyke entered down one of the aisles and worked the stage, trying to remember the lines he was supposed to have down cold by opening rehearsal. Jerry would be recreating for the stage the film role that made Andy Griffith famous. I had never played in the round with the audience totally surrounding the stage, and never in front of this many people. My small scene as a radio operator counting down the big blast was staged in the middle of one section of the audience. The director was off the payroll after the final dress rehearsal. He said a few words of farewell and told us to break a leg. No Time for Sergeants opened to a full house. Every night after the show, we'd party with the cast in Anaheim. Then Clint and I would take the midnight ride up the Santa Ana Freeway. The next night we'd do it all over again. One day driving in my new '64 Ford T-Bird convertible, the next day in his barely running old Ford convertible with the threadbare top. We got to know each other pretty well. Currently working in a garage as a gopher, Clint Ritchie was determined to succeed as an actor. We both knew he had all the tools, including the most important one. He wanted it real bad. Clint was also very friendly and outgoing, a buddy with all the girls and flirting with the several girls in the cast and crew. One of the girls was a statuesque blonde whose only physical defect was her left eye, which seemed to wander when she looked at you. Otherwise, she was perfect and friendly. One midnight, when the after-show party broke up in Anaheim, she slid in between Clint and me in the front seat of his old Ford, and we headed north towards Hollywood. After a few minutes, our blonde friend had her head on Clint's shoulder and her hands in his jeans. I tried to stare straight ahead at the light freeway traffic. As we approached the downtown interchange, Clint whispered something in her ear. She turned to me, smiled, and reached for my belt buckle. The Capitol Records tower was a blur as we sped by. Inside the ragged-top convertible, her long hair was all over my bare skin. "You've never seen my pad," Clint said, driving right past my North Hollywood exit. We took the Van Nuys off-ramp, crossed Ventura Boulevard, and drove a few blocks up into the hills. Clint's apartment was unbelievably tiny. Kitchenette, bath, sofa. We all three climbed the ladder to a loft big enough for a king-size mattress. So this was the sex of the 60s. No fear, no long-term commitment, no guilt, no jealousy. Just doing what came naturally, exercising your fundamental right as a human being, following the program of your genes. Sexual adventure became the juice of life for the rest of the decade. Every generation has its own variation on the timeless art of relationships. For us, in the 60s in California, we thought we were inventing it for the first time. Perhaps it was only taking self-indulgence to a new low, or a high, depending on how you looked at it. But Clint Ritchie and I were definitely on to a different kind of male bonding. Sharing a girl surely beat trading war stories. When No Time for Sergeants closed, Jerry Van Dyke went on to a lackluster career before finally landing the best role of his life on Coach. Clint and I stayed in touch for a while, his career creeping along. When George C. Scott came upon the death and devastation of a tank battleground in the movie Patton and spoke the line, "God forgive me, but I do love it," the young wounded and dazed captain up on the big screen with Patton was Clint Ritchie. Clint showed up in several films, including the Western Joe Kidd with Eastwood, Duvall, and John Saxon. For years I lost track. I couldn't believe that this guy hadn't been able to make it as an actor. Not being a fan of daytime television, I didn't realize that Clint Ritchie was in fact living his dream as Buchanan on the soap opera One Life to Live.
Can't leave your hat on. Can't leave your hat on. You can't leave your hat on.
North Hollywood, Memorial Day, 1964.
Please lock me away and don't allow the day.
Smokey Robards was strumming his lyric harp and singing the Peter and Gordon song, which was already headed for the top 10. We were all sitting around the patio at 6418 Babcock in North Hollywood. Kate and Russ were handling the barbecue pit. The guys were doing our caveman thing. Know who wrote that song? I asked, already knowing the answer since I'd heard Casey Kasem announce it last week on KRLA. Danny Truitt thought a minute. Gee, I don't know. Come on, David, who cares? What is this, 20 questions? Charles Laquadera complained, bouncing 12-month-old John David on his knee. Then he asked the only question on his mind. Hey, Kate, when's that barbecue going to be ready? Vince D'Onofrio was playing tag with Russ's 3 kids. He didn't miss the opportunity to blast Laquadera. It was one of his favorite things to do. It's John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote it, Vince yelled. You're really out of touch, Charlie. Vince said our barbecues were bourgeois middle-class suburbia. Kate said he could split any time it got too bourgeois for him. He always stayed. Smokey continued to strum his lyric harp. He had just returned from several weeks of training after joining the National Guard to escape the draft, but now he seemed highly programmed and had trouble relating to the rest of the group. His daily goal was to put a top-quality spit shine on all his shoes. After a while, Smokey had begun to get back to his music, but his bout with boot camp had put us all closer to military life. Danny had just joined the Marine National Guard. Unlike Smokey, he really would have liked to go full-time, but his agent had convinced Danny he could get him a film deal if he stayed in town. Observing their reactions to the military indoctrination, I was piecing it all together with what I'd seen as an actor at Lackland in the Air Force recruiting film. Back home in Louisiana, my dad was undergoing shock treatments. Casey had a nervous breakdown seemingly for no reason. His life should have been going fine, but he stayed depressed and had nightmares. Mom had to seek treatment for him in a New Orleans hospital. Tying him down and turning on the juice was the standard treatment. I thought about the bullet hole and the 6-inch long scar and the gold heart with the purple ribbon. I wondered if there was a connection. I looked at John David and thanked him silently for the 3A deferment. It was dark by the time Russ and Kate served up the barbecue. We wolfed it down. The party moved indoors, and the television news showed some of the holiday's events, including memorial services from around the country. Danny was visibly moved. I'd be ready to die for my country, he blurted out. Vince was on him immediately. What are you, Danny? Some kind of nut or something? Die for your country? What's that supposed to mean? It means he's not afraid to stand up and fight for his freedom, Smokey said, reaching for his lyric harp. Well, I'm not afraid either, Charles piped in. I'm not afraid to tell you I'm scared shitless. Whatever I got to do to get out of the draft, I'm going to do it. I'll act queer if I have to. You're already queer, Charlie. Danny was getting worked up. You're some kind of fag commie, and you don't deserve to live in America. Why don't you move to Russia? Why don't you move your ass outside, butthole? I'll show you what a fag is, Charlie said. Danny sprang to his feet, flashing his dancer's poise as he moved into his karate stance. That's it, commie fag. On your feet, Danny said. Smokey quickly placed himself between Danny and Charles. Vince launched a verbal attack on Charles. That's really smart, Charlie. Can't you see Danny's been brainwashed? You're going to get yourself killed confronting a brainwashed zombie like that. You're the one who's brainwashed, Danny screamed, ready to take the house apart. I grabbed John David and retreated to the kitchen, where Kate was cleaning up from dinner. She came storming back into the living room with a look on her face that froze the action. What the hell is going in here? She demanded. This is the 20th century, fellas. You mean to tell me y'all can't have a conversation without trying to kill each other? The boys looked around sheepishly. Then Charles began to apologize. Oh, it was nothing. I'm the butthole, okay? Sorry, Danny. I didn't mean anything. He stuck out his hand. Danny would take longer to cool off, but he shook Laquadera's hand and went into the kitchen. After a moment, Vince began talking. You know what we just witnessed here is what's happening to this country. We're all running around spouting slogans and calling each other names, and nobody's really listening to anybody else. Smokey was strumming the lyric harp and spoke up. We've got to have people willing to fight if we're going to contain communism. You guys don't know what's going on in Vietnam. We saw some film at boot camp. You wouldn't believe what the Viet Cong are doing. America better wake up. What about what we're doing in Vietnam? Kate said, ready to mix it up. What are we doing over there anyway? And you know so much about Vietnam? Vince asked. I know somebody who does, Kate blasted back. My world history instructor at Valley State just got back from a year in Nam. The Army is spending millions of dollars burning the jungle. As fast as they burn it, it grows up again. It's like trying to keep the grass mowed in Louisiana. While you're mowing the backyard, the front yard grows up to your crotch again. Now they're starting to use chemicals. What's that going to do to the environment? I came in from the kitchen. Danny followed, carrying John David on his shoulders. Hey, Charles, I said, changing the subject. March Saul is on at 10 o'clock. Have you guys seen what March Saul is doing? Charles said. He wants to reopen the investigation of the Kennedy assassination. He's got proof it was a conspiracy. Danny dropped to the floor and lifted John David off his shoulders. Listen, everybody, Danny was smiling. John David says he wants to apologize for acting like a 1-year-old just now, and if you'll all give him a chance, he'll try to grow up. Smokey strummed his lyric harp and sang Lennon and McCartney.
I don't care what they say, I won't stay in a world without love.
In 1964, little Millie Small was 17 when producer Chris Blackwell brought her to England to record My Boy Lollipop, and Rod Stewart played harmonica on the session. The song helped develop the musical styles of reggae and ska. Blackwell later discovered and worked with Bob Marley.
North Hollywood, July 1964. Kate was singing to John David as he walked in circles around the living room floor. She was 5 months pregnant and starting to show. The new baby would have to be a little brother for John David and was already being referred to as Bruh. I was on the phone with Ken Rose, planning the next Sulla Theater production. Ken had directed all of us at the Pasadena Playhouse. He was a very intense guy. We called him a mad genius. He was also from Lake Charles, Louisiana. Ken had opened the Sulla Theater, a little workshop theater on Cahuenga in Hollywood, in the basement of a 6-story slum hotel called the Padre. Under Ken's direction, the cellar was already getting a reputation for good work when Charles, Smokey, Bud Tedesco, and I joined the group. We were thinking about doing Gorky's Lower Depths, a Russian drama, boring as hell, but I had a shot at the lead. Smokey and I had gotten good reviews from the Hollywood Reporter for the previous show, Tiger at the Gates. If you kept working at it in Hollywood, sooner or later you'd be seen by the right people, or you'd luck into the right contact. True or not, that was the theory all beginning actors operate on. I was back on the air. In a state of shock over the Kennedy assassination, Charles had blown our classical job at KPPC while I was down in Miami last December. Charles had sneaked in a copy of Camelot and played it 6 days in a row before the complaint surfaced. The PD reminded La Cuadera it was an FM station, and therefore strictly a classical format. Then he gave him the boot. 6 months later, however, the church fathers were convinced they could bring more money into the church coffers by switching KPPC to a conservative pop format. My actor friend Mike Stroka sold the church on his general manager ability, and I got the call for the 6 a.m. to 12 noon shift. I was behind the mic again at 106.7. A few days earlier, Bonnie Helmuth called me looking for a dancer to audition with her for a big movie that was coming up at 20th Century Fox. I called Danny Truitt. Since the interview, Danny had missed his daily afternoon visits, so I figured there had been no news. I figured maybe something might be cooking. Around 2 p.m., just as we had John David packed up for the beach, Danny burst through the door. His sandy brown hair had been bleached blonde, and his ear-to-ear grin told the story. He had gotten his break. He was going to play the young Nazi soldier in The Sound of Music. We all piled into my '64 T-Bird convertible and drove out into the San Fernando Valley, then over the hill through Topanga Canyon to the beach at Malibu. Danny was talking nonstop. He'd gone through several auditions, met the director, been screen tested, and walked off with the male juvenile lead. Besides several excellent dramatic scenes, he would dance and sing Rodgers and Hammerstein's 16 Going on 17 with the film's ingenue. They were talking with the studio about a 7-year contract, and he would leave in 3 days to shoot on location in Austria. At the beach, we stretched out on blankets and watched the Pacific roll in. Kate warmed John David's bottle in the sand while Danny tried to show John David the principles of building a sandcastle. We were all overwhelmed with joy by Danny's good fortune. Only 3 years in this town, and one of us had scored big. We just knew we all would. This showbiz is a piece of cake.
Under the boardwalk, down by the sea, yeah. On a blanket with my baby, that's where I'll be.
North Hollywood, October 1964.
We'll sing in the sunshine. We'll laugh every day. We'll sing in the sunshine. Then I'll be on my way.
The alarm clock went off, pulling me out of dreamland and putting Wink Martindale's morning show from KRLA and Gail Garnett's hit song in my bedroom. It was Saturday. I had a rare day off from KPBC and had slept past the regular 4:30 a.m. wake time all the way up toward 10 o'clock. I lay there for a minute recounting the last few days. Kate was still in the hospital recovering from the 2-month premature delivery of baby Michelle. So John David's little bruh had turned out to be a girl, a tiny one. At only 4 pounds, she would be in the incubator at least 6 weeks before she came home. Without Kate around, it was like a college boy's dorm gone bad. Smokey and Charles had been staying over, often coming in at dawn after chasing all night in Hollywood. They had been a help with John David, Charles changing his diaper occasionally and Smokey singing and playing the guitar for him. At 17 months, John David was talking a blue streak and was all over the house. I had attached a restraining accordion gate to his bedroom door. The result was he would trash his room if you didn't get to him as soon as he woke up. Realizing it was about that time, I turned Wink's radio volume down. That's when I heard the sloshing from the bathroom. Moving quickly through the hall, I glanced into the other bedroom. Smokey and Charles were both out cold, their mouths wide open with slightly audible snores. The room was trashed all right, drawers pulled out, clothes strewn about. Charles's arm hung to the floor. A diaper lay across it. John David must have figured it was diaper-changing time. Toys were scattered, and his little chair was pulled up next to the locked accordion gate. He'd made an escape. I reached the bathroom where the sloshing sounds were. There was John David with an ear-to-ear grin, both hands in the toilet bowl. What could I say? I cleaned him up a bit, unlocked the obsolete gate, and changed the sagging diaper. Carrying John David under one arm like a sack of potatoes, we headed for the front yard. I turned him loose to toddle around and harass the snails that collected in the flower beds. Picking up the Los Angeles Times from the sidewalk, I positioned my lounge chair to greet the late morning sun and leaned back. October being as good as August for getting a year-round California tan. L.A. Times had it all. A write-up on the Warren Commission's report that was only a few weeks old and drawing heavy controversy. Led by Laquadera's nearly obsessed belief in a Kennedy assassination plot, we debated, almost nightly, the pros and cons with Vince and the gang. The bottom of the front page read, Cole Porter dies. I played Cole Porter's songs on KPPC. Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, they all sang him. Plus there were hundreds of big band and jazz instrumental arrangements. He'd written a bunch. You could play Cole Porter just any time you wanted. I get no kick from cocaine. Mere alcohol doesn't move me at all. Sinatra sang it. I played it. John David looked up from his dirt pile play area as I sang aloud and flipped through the Times. Comedian Lenny Bruce was still getting arrested for vulgarity on stage. The police were having trouble with his act. Vince said it wasn't the dirty words, it was his ideas and attitude that was really bothering them. Whatever it was, Lenny was being viewed by the law as a distasteful component of society. Here's more on the 3 civil rights workers who were killed down in Mississippi. It was hard for me to identify with what was going on in the South. Whatever racial problems we had in South Louisiana, they weren't the same as in Mississippi and Alabama. There just wasn't that much hatred in the Bayou country. Perhaps some of the older Cajuns remembered being second-class citizens themselves. Smokey and I were constantly telling Laquadera it wasn't quite that way in our hometowns. He accused us of not only being bigots, but also refusing to face the truth. Maybe he was partially right. But in Abbeville, Louisiana, and El Dorado, Arkansas, there weren't any crazy crackers burning down black homes like they were doing in Mississippi. Flipping over to the editorial section, I found another article on Vietnam. Headlines: U.S. says it will fight to defend Asia. I wondered what that meant exactly. I'll bet Vince D'Onofrio could give me an opinion about 180 degrees from the writer in the LA Times. But then Vince was rapidly becoming a left-wing extremist. Barry Goldwater says extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. President Johnson wants to campaign on the plank against left and right extremists. Who are you going to believe? Barry Goldwater or Vince D'Onofrio? Certainly not Lyndon Johnson. More advisors being sent to Vietnam. U.S. planes attacking North Vietnam bases. It keeps heating up over there, I said to John David as he grinned back at me. I browsed through the sports section. Cassius Clay, now Muhammad Ali, says he won't be drafted. What a champ. Vince loves him. Boxing and baseball, those were a couple of things Vince still loved about America. Is that worth defending? I didn't know where I stood. I picked up the sack of potatoes kid, brushing the squished snails out of his fingers. Turning John David loose, I tuned in to Sam Riddle, who had just started his shift on KRLA. Then I sat back to finish up the Times. At UCLA Berkeley, Mario Salvo was still raising hell with the free speech movement. Massive political protests were being organized. The Haight-Ashbury district, heart of the hippie movement. Can you dig it? Kids everywhere with long hair. I like long hair, but this is wild. The miniskirts, girls all wearing these short dresses. In no time at all, they'd be all over Los Angeles. I folded up the Times and turned up KRLA. I leaned back in the October sun. Sam Riddle, sounding about 17 years old, introduced the #1 song, and Roy Orbison's magnificent and unique voice flowed over my corner of North Lake.
I don't believe you, you're not the truth. No one could look as good as you.
In 1964,
Mercy.
recorded for Monument Records in Nashville, Pretty Woman sold more records in its first 10 days in release than any other 45 single in history.
Her voice was soft and cool, her eyes were clear and bright, but she's not bad.
I'd worked my 6 a.m. to 12 noon shift at KPPC FM and caught up on a couple of hours of sleep. Kate and I were walking out to go vote when Charles Laquadara drove up in a brand new convertible Volkswagen with the Zombies cranked up in real loud on the radio. Charles had been very down. He tried to join the LAPD, hoping that being a policeman would give him a draft deferment. He blew past the academics, the rigorous physical test, and the obstacle course, but he flunked the psychological profile. Charles just didn't have the killer instinct to be a cop. As the time to report for his draft physical got closer, he developed the idea of faking a bad back. He bought a back brace, but it looked brand new, so in an attempt to age it, he and Kate washed it a dozen times. He picked at the threads to make it look ragged. In a last desperate attempt, he laid the back brace out on the driveway, and with John David beside him on the front seat, he drove the car back and forth over the brace for 20 minutes. He slept with it several nights to make marks on his skin. Then finally, this morning, he had reported to the draft board. To his amazement, they said he really did have a back problem and would have a lot of pain in the future. That was the future. Today he was a free man, and he ran out to celebrate buying a new car. That night, Charles brought over Dr. Howard Richardson, author of the play called Dark of the Moon, in which Charles had starred as Witchboy, the lead role. We talked theater, then politics, watching Lyndon Johnson beat up on Barry Goldwater in a landslide. In New York, Robert F. Kennedy won his first election to a Senate post. Our immediate speculation was on the possible return of Camelot.
Well, no one told me about her, the way she lied.
Hollywood, December 1964.
Today, while the blossoms still cling to the vine, I'll taste your strawberries, I'll drink your sweet wine.
Nick Woods was singing lead on the Randy Sparks composition on stage at the Troubadour. He was backed by 2 girls on tambourines and 6 other musicians playing a variety of acoustic 6 and 12-string guitars, mandolins, and banjos. Randy Sparks' New Christie minstrels were hot. A friend of Smokey's, Barry McGuire, had earned a spot in the group, and we'd all come down to see him. Nick Woods was knocking me out. It had been a great week. I'd received a call from MGM 2 nights earlier saying I had a day's work on Dr. Kildare. Only 2 lines, only minimum pay, but it was the easiest and most exciting $100 I'd ever earned. Richard Chamberlain was courteous and professional. Meeting the guest star Ed Begley Sr. was a rare treat. Watching them work was a high. I'd met Herschel Daugherty a few weeks earlier. He said he'd use me. His word was good. I now had my Screen Actors Guild card. It was a giant step. That's the way it works in Hollywood. Friends were doing well. Danny Truitt was driving a new GTO with his Sound of Music money. One of our classmates from Pasadena, Chris Conley, had a running part on Peyton Place, the new twice-a-week TV series based on the movie. I'd been to visit Chris on Peyton Place set and met his co-stars Ryan O'Neal and Mia Farrow. At KPPC, General Manager Mike Stroka was working on King Rat starring George Segal, which meant no one was leading the station in any particular direction. We were just playing records. I knew all the standard big band songs and every show tune. I liked the music, but it wasn't rock and roll. That's what I really wanted to be playing. Listening to the big top 40 jocks in L.A., I began to wonder if I ever would get to be a rock jock. These guys were good. They were fast. They were witty. They were always sounding bright and happy. And cool. Like B. Mitchell Reed, the fastest tongue in the West. Big market sound. Could I do that? Did I want to do that? Maybe I was too laid back, more like Casey Kasem, filled with music biz info. I was already going in that direction, playing movie themes and show tunes, talking about who was in the movie, who directed it, and who wrote the song. Maybe. All I wanted to do was act. The Cellar Theater was going well. Ken Rose's brilliant direction was bringing out the best in his performers. We were all students of method acting, popularized by Brando and James Dean. But staying in character, in the moment, was not always a simple task. During rehearsals, you could see Rose at the edge of the stage. Then he'd disappear into the darkness. But he was there, maybe only a couple of feet beyond the lights. Just when you felt you had reached the depths of your character's soul, Ken would appear inches from your face. "I've been watching you," Ken would say, "and you're lying to me. I can see it in your eyes." Whipped. You'd start the scene again and again until Ken Rose said the words you craved to hear. Good. I believed you that time. It was all very time-consuming. I was often rehearsing until midnight, talking until 1, getting to bed at 2, and getting up at 4 a.m., getting dressed while Kate fed Tiny Shell with an eyedropper, then driving through Glendale to Pasadena, turning the transmitter on, putting KPPC on the air, and playing 6 hours of music I was only half excited about. While there was no obvious reason to be uneasy, there was an underlying unrest all about us. Not just me personally. It seemed to me the whole country was getting more uptight. Certainly Los Angeles was. A couple of weeks earlier, during a cellar rehearsal break, Bud, Charles, Smokey, and I were standing in the alley of the Padre Hotel when the Los Angeles Police Department patrol car pulled in from the street. 2 cops with guns drawn put us up against the wall and frisked us. We convinced them that we were actors with a legitimate reason for hanging out in the Padre Alley. They claimed they were looking for robbery suspects in the neighborhood, and we fit the profile. Back at home later, we had a laugh about the incident, but none of us forgot looking down the barrel of the LAPD. "Hey, Brother Dave, where you at?" Smokey was asking, his glass held high for a toast. "Right with you," I answered, raising my glass. Tomorrow's battles belong to tomorrow. Tonight was our night, and Nick Woods singing lead at the Troubadour.
I'll be a dandy and I'll be a rover. You'll know who I am by the song that I sing.
KPPC-FM, Pasadena Presbyterian Church, January 1965. I was born in Dixie in a boomer shack, just a little shanty by the railroad track. Freight train whistle taught me how to cry. Hum of the drivers was my lullaby.
I got the freight train blues.
The soundtrack from My Fair Lady was on the air at KPPC. On the other turntable, in the audition channel, was the young man from Hemming, Minnesota, singing through his nose the freight trade blues. I was leaning back in my disc jockey chair, reading the liner notes on the back of the Columbia album titled simply Bob Dylan. It also included the classic A Man of Constant Sorrow. I'd heard a lot about Dylan. Now I was really getting into him. The young singer-songwriter was 23 now, only 5 months older than me, and he had turned the folk world on its ear. Reading the liner notes, I learned that Dylan played harmonica like Sonny Terry. Who was Sonny Terry, I wondered? Or Walter Jacobs, who played harmonica with Muddy Waters in Chicago. I knew about Muddy Waters. It says here the Freight Train Blues was adapted from a Roy Acuff disc. I figured if it was a train song, it had to go all the way back to Jimmie Rodgers. Yep, Jimmie Rodgers was credited as the writer, along with Jack Kingston and Marvin Rainwater. I could see Casey singing in the shade under that South Louisiana pecan tree.
My daddy was a brakeman, and my mommy dear was the only daughter of an engineer.
Well, Dylan also listened to Jimmie Rodgers, Woody Guthrie, Jelly Roll Morton, Carl Blue Suede Shoes Perkins, and Elvis. No wonder Dylan sounded so good. He'd done his homework. Other names like Dave Van Ronk and Blind Lemon Jefferson were not familiar to me. There's a gold mine of information on liner notes, I thought. I wondered why disc jockeys didn't just put some of that information on the air instead of all that time and temperature stuff. It was 10 a.m. I'd flipped My Fair Lady to the second side and was listening to Bob Dylan sing Rick Van Schmidt's Baby Let Me Follow You Down when General Manager Mike Stroka opened the studio door. "Hey, Pierce," he said, "put a long record on and come into my office. I want you to meet our new PD." A new program director. That means 1, you lose your job. 2, you get a different shift. 3, the format was in for a change, or any combination of the above. Stroka's office contained several pictures of himself in various roles as an actor. He apparently had a day off from shooting King Rat and took this opportunity to bring in the new program director, Walt Da Silva, a 40-year-old disc jockey who had been working at one of LA's FM jazz stations. Walt was brief. There would be an evaluation of all air personnel. Some changes were probable. The air sound would be adjusted. We'd play sets of 2 or 3 records at a time. No more talk after every record or playing whole sides of a show tune. At least one song in every set would be instrumental. At least one song would be jazz-oriented. That answers number 3 about the format change. "Any questions?" Walt was asking in his best radio voice. "Yeah, will you be on the air?" I asked. Walt hesitated and looked at Stroka. "To show us how you want it done," I added quickly. "We're still considering it." Stroka came back just as quickly. So someone was going to lose his shift. Back in the control room, I checked on My Fair Lady. It had a few more minutes. Jazz, huh? Just when I finally knew all the movie themes and soundtracks. Jazz had always been a little foreign to my ear. Most of it was too far out. It didn't sound like music. It couldn't have that big an audience. But then I really didn't know that much about it. Why didn't we just move into a rock format? Or at least folk? 2 and 3 record sets? That sounded very interesting. 2 Bob Dylan songs back-to-back in a 2-record set. Now that would grab some listeners. Stroka stuck his head in the door. "Hey, you put us on the spot in the meeting. We aren't ready to let everyone know Walt will be on the air." "Just interested," I said. "Well, keep it to yourself, but the afternoon disc jockey is going to be axed. Walt's got that shift. We're going to fire the newsman and the weekend people, too. But don't worry, we want you to stay in the morning slot." Answers to number 1 and number 2. "Well, thanks for letting me know, Mike. By the way, why jazz? This station doesn't stand a chance in hell in this market unless we rock. Why not be the first one in the country to play rock and roll on FM?" Mike looked at me funny. I had his attention. "We'll talk about it later," said, making his exit. "For now, you listen to Walt Da Silva." "Sure, I'll listen to Walt. I'll play jazz till my ears hurt. Someday, somebody's going to do it right." I checked My Fair Lady and put Bob Dylan back on the audition channel.
I got the freight train blues. Got 'em in the bottom of my rambling shoe. And when the whistle blows, I gotta go.
Bob Dylan learned a great deal about harmonica playing while listening to Sonny Terry. Terry didn't play mic'd-up electric blues, but wrapped his big hands around the harp and could make it talk, sing, cry, or laugh. They say Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee were the Sunshine Boys gone mad.
North Hollywood, February 1965. Ron Atkins had been back in L.A. for several weeks. His wife from Long Beach had wanted out of Dallas, As soon as they got back to Southern California, she left him. So he was hanging out at our house a lot. He'd drive up the freeway from Downey on Friday nights, and we'd head up to Big Bear to snow ski on Saturday, then roll out to Zuma Beach on Sunday. Only in Los Angeles could you do that, and we Southern boys were still excited about that kind of recreational variety. Ron was babysitting for us often. He and John David were big buddies. Tonight, Ron brought over a stuffed monkey named Oscar. Ron had also developed a character voice for Oscar. It seemed Oscar had a fear of catching camel fever. The whole scene was driving 20-month-old John David delirious with excitement. Oscar was real. The threat of camel fever was so real that John David and Ron and Oscar were building camel traps out of chairs and sofa cushions. They were hoping to catch those camels coming out of the kitchen before they got to the living room and infected Oscar and possibly the rest of us with low-grade fever of the camel variety. I was observing the fun while Kate sang a Lennon and McCartney lullaby to the tiny pink bundle named Michelle. When the camel traps had all been set and John David and Oscar got into their own thing, the adults started to talk radio. The jazz format had caused a little excitement. A few little old Pasadena ladies had called KPPC to complain. They had liked my show tunes. They disliked the jazz as much as if it had been rock and roll. Actually, it was too soon to evaluate the new format, and I was learning the music and the artist. "Who gets paid the most money at a radio station?" Ron asked, leaning back against the camel trap. "Well, the manager, of course," I answered. "Naturally," Ron agreed, smiling his big southern grin. "And who else?" I was beginning to wonder where he was going with this. "Well, probably the salesman, except at KPPC because they're not selling anything, but normally the salesmen do well." "Is that right?" Ron acted overly surprised. "Better than the disc jockeys?" "Well, it depends. Top jocks in a big market do really well. Otherwise, I guess salesmen and managers carry out most of the dollars." Ron took a dramatic pause before he asked the question. "So why aren't you selling radio instead of just playing records you don't like?" "Because I'm a disc jockey. That's what I do. I'm not a salesman. I wouldn't know where to start." "Nothing to it. Easiest thing in the world." "Easy? Easy for you to say. You've sold insurance in Dallas. Now you're selling Goodyear tires and accessories to every brother in Downey. You've got the personality for it. I don't." "I wouldn't mind selling radio," Kate jumped in. "That's damn sure where the money is at. It sure as hell ain't playing jazz at KPPC or movie themes or whatever the hell you'll be playing next month." "The money's in rock," I countered. "It's the only thing really worth doing." The knock at the door was Smokey and Henry Capps. They were just coming in from a recording session in Hollywood and were really pumped up. Lorne Green, the star of Bonanza, had gone to the top of the charts in December with a song called Ringo. At tonight's session, he had recorded his next release, a song written by Smokey and Henry called Pop Goes the Hammer. It was a real break for them as songwriters and would definitely open some more doors. The conversation wore on. Midnight came and went. Finally, by 2 a.m., everyone was leaving and I was able to drag into bed, only to have the alarm tear me out again at 4 a.m. But now I was on to some little helpers, diet pills, available by prescription from your local MD. A couple of times a week, when the sleep was scarce and the coming day was long, I'd pop a gray and yellow. Of course, there was a downside that hit you 12 to 16 hours later. Aching muscles, inability to sleep the next night. It took a day to get over it. But at 5 a.m., I'm driving into Pasadena feeling terrific. Besides a constantly dry mouth and a desire to talk a lot, it was going to be a great day. The memory of Johnny Cash gulping a handful sometimes crossed my mind, but I blew it off. Like I'd done a couple of 100 times before, I walked down the steps of the church to the basement. Total silence, except for the sounds I made. The click of the door latch. Boot heels across the cement of the unfinished studio for the TV station that was never licensed. The rush of power as the transmitter came to life. The clack, clack, clacking of the teletype machine as I pulled stories for the 6:05 newscast. I sat in my squeaky chair, adjusted my headset. At 6 a.m. straight up, I hit the sign-on tape cartridge. I'm a disc jockey. This is what I do. It ain't glamorous. It don't pay much. It's a killer shift, and it ain't rock and roll. But it is radio. I punched up the Star-Spangled Banner cartridge while Lennon and McCartney's songs rolled around in my head.
In 1965, new innovations were soft contact lenses and the lava lamp. Jerry Garcia forms the Warlocks and later the Grateful Dead. U.S. report, cigarettes peril your health. U.S. planes attack North Vietnam. And Ernesto Che Guevara drops off the radar to organize guerrillas in Bolivia.
Hollywood, March 1965.
I've learned to hate the Russians all through my whole life. If another war starts, it's them we must fight.
Woodrow Bernard, his brother Marion, and my dad, Casey Pierce, had all fought in World War II. Casey was wounded. Marion Bernard was killed in action. After the war, Woodrow worked 18 years for Continental Oil Company. He was pro-business, pro-America, pro-military, and pro-religion. Casey was the opposite on all points. As I grew up in the 50s, I had watched Woodrow and Casey often debate those issues till past midnight. Today, Woodrow was up against a much more formidable opponent. His name was Vincent D'Onofrio. The Italian rebel from Detroit, along with Charles Laquadera, had all come over to enjoy some of my mom's Cajun cooking. My parents and the Bernards were visiting us in Los Angeles, and they were running head-on into the beginning of the generation gap. "Your problem, young man, is you have no knowledge or respect for history." Woodrow Bernard fired another round at Vince D'Onofrio. "History tells me that it's the young men who do the fighting and dying and you old guys who start the wars," Vince shot back. "Let me tell you something, fella. I fought in World War II and I'd do it again. My son, Woody Bernard, is about to join the Green Berets, and I'm encouraging him to do it. You, Dave, and this Laquadera boy should all join. You'd be doing yourself a favor. You'd be doing something for your country." "Doing myself a favor?" Vince sneered. "This is still a free country, and I'm free to decide when I'm doing myself a favor, and as sure as hell ain't going to be in Nam. If your boy's crazy enough to go be a Green Beret, that's his choice. I can't believe you'd encourage him to do that. Suppose he gets shot. Suppose he gets killed. How you going to feel? Some father you are." Woodrow jumped to his feet, fuming. "I'd feel proud knowing he defended his country against communism, but it makes my blood boil to know left-wingers like you wouldn't even appreciate it." "Defend his country against communism? What's that supposed to mean?" Vince asked incredulously. What happened to Nazism? What happened to the old boogeyman socialism? That's just another slogan that you use to imprison our thinking so real ideas don't come out, so we can't see through all the lies and bullshit. Bullshit? What I see in front of me is bullshit. A worthless young man with a Beatle haircut. I'd like to see you with your head shaved, taking orders from a drill instructor. Well, dream on, mister. The Detroit kid stood face to face with the older man, because this is one poor bastard who ain't going to put his ass on the line so your oil company, Lyndon Johnson, and the Brown and Root Construction Company of Houston, Texas, can pour some more cement and build some more airfields in Southeast Asia. Well, you disrespectful son of a bitch. Woodrow could no longer contain his anger. I ought to take you outside and teach you a lesson. Calm down, everybody, Casey interrupted. Yeah, y'all all sit down, I suggested. We're all just talking here. Casey was still recovering from his nervous breakdown and several weeks in a New Orleans psychiatric ward. Getting over shock treatment was slow. He was on tranquilizers, but was methodically beating off addiction by breaking the tranks into pieces and taking only 1/4 of a pill at a time. His psychiatrist couldn't come up with a diagnosis of a reason for his depression. By now I was convinced it was related to World War II. War stories brought him to tears, which were welling up in his eyes now. I grabbed Casey by the arm and we stepped outside to sit on the front steps and breathe the smoggy San Fernando Valley air.
Auch die Deutschen haben Gott auf ihr Seite.
The Germans now, too, have God on their side.
Inside, we could hear the debate continue at a slightly less hostile level. It's all slogans, Vince kept up the needling. Like escalation. All of a sudden, that's the new operative word for Vietnam. They wouldn't come right out and say they're going to send 1 million more boys to Vietnam because this whole country would go into a full-scale revolution. And I'm not just talking about a few disgruntled students. So instead of telling us the truth, the government invents words like incursion, pacification, escalation. They ship our boys out 5 and 10,000 at a time and call it escalation. That's doublespeak, straight out of fucking George Orwell. It's all 1984, only it's 20 goddamn years early. We'll send whatever it takes in men and material to kick their commie asses, Woodrow said with authority. If we don't stop the Reds in Southeast Asia, they'll be coming in our back door from Mexico. Convinced that all Southerners were bigots, Charles jumped into the fray, attacking from a different direction. "Mr. Bernard," he asked very politely, "what do you think of Martin Luther King marching in Selma, Alabama this week? Do you think he's a communist?" "No, I think he's a smart-ass Negro or a dumb Negro, depending on how you look at it," Woodrow Bernard replied. "I think he's being used by the communists. And yes, there are communists in his organization. The NAACP is full of left-wingers and socialists. And those sympathy marches by whites all over the country, they're all communists too? Charles continued to quiz Woodrow. Maybe not, but they're misguided, Woodrow said, now back in control. The same as some of you young people. You just don't understand the way whites and Negroes relate to each other in the South. Have you seen I Spy on TV? Vince asked, not willing to let Woodrow off the hook. You know, the one with Robert Culp and Bill Cosby. Would you classify them as a nigger and a commie? Look at your history, boys, Woodrow replied. You'll learn something, and you won't be so easily led. Well, I guess it's like Bob Dylan says, the times they are changing, Charles offered. Well, times change, but reality doesn't. And the reality is a lot of boys died in the past so that you can have the freedom to speak out, Woodrow said, knowing he wasn't convincing these young men. You think you can talk this way in Russia? Think about that. Freedom of speech wasn't earned by guys like you or this Bob Dylan character. I looked at Casey and asked him if he wanted to take a walk. No, he was ready to go back inside. His fight was over. So was Woodrow's. The next fight belonged to Vince D'Onofrio, Charles Lockwood Era, Woody Bernard, and me. And it wouldn't only be in Vietnam or Southeast Asia. It was going to happen right here in our homes. I'd have to pick a side.
If God's on our side, he'll stop the next war.